Hello, listeners. Welcome to another episode of the Jacob Shapiro podcast. As usual, I'm your host. I'm Jacob Shapiro, partner and director of Geopolitical Analysis at Cognitive Investments. Rob and I are back at it for our weekly chat. Before we get into it, one brief point of housekeeping, and we talk about this for the first couple minutes of the podcast, but we are exploring starting something like a Club CI, some kind of affinity group for people who are interested in geopolitics, innovation, a lot of the topics that we discuss in this podcast, but are not necessarily interested in the financial services and some of the other investment services that we are providing to clients. So if you are the type of person who wants to or finds themselves wanting to talk about and hang out with people who are interested in the topics that we talk about on this podcast, and you wish that you had more time with people like that or with like-minded people like that, and you wish you had access to more content about those sorts of things, email me directly at jacob@cognitive.investments. We'll send you a survey and a sign-up form to gauge interest in this sort of thing. And if there is enough interest, we may try and put something together. So again, if that is you, if you are, I'm shocked that we're even doing this, but we did a survey to our listeners and a lot of people asked for this. So we're following up now. So if that is you, if you are interested in that, email me directly at jacob@cognitive.investments, and I will share with you some initial information about some of the things we're doing or thinking about in terms of piloting that. Otherwise, not a whole lot else for me. We'll make sure to put a link to the report that we discussed in the latter half of the podcast in the show notes. I hope you all are taking care of the people that you love. Cheers. See you out there. All right, well, Rob, before we get started this morning, and it's bright and early for me, if you're looking at me on the YouTube, guys, this is what I look like approximately 22 minutes after I roll out of bed. That's how much I care about you guys listening to this podcast. We mentioned in the intro, we don't exactly know what to call it yet. We've been calling it Club CI, Planet CI. If you've got a better name, maybe reach out to me and tell me after we tell you what it is, what you think it should be called. But the idea is we've had lots of people who aren't necessarily interested in consuming our services who still are interested in geopolitics and innovation and investing and want to either be connected to other folks who have similar interests or want to be able to talk to us about some of these things. It never ceases to amaze me, Rob, that people after listening to this podcast want to talk to us more. I would think that you would be completely bored and afraid of us, and just the fact that you're listening to me is a compliment. But there it is. So as I said in the intro, you can email me directly at jacob@cognitive.investments, and we will send you some more details. We don't even know if we're doing it yet. We're piloting it. We're putting out some feelers. We're seeing if it makes sense to try and set up. Is there anything you want to add, Rob, to tell the listeners about what it is and why they should email us if they want to?
No, well, I haven't heard your introductory comments because you haven't recorded them yet, but
I know.
so I'm sure you'll cover most of these points. So
Time travel is our first thing on the innovation strategy that we want to discuss with these new Planet CI members.
yeah, no, I guess the only thing I would say is I think what we're looking for is to create something that's unique and special and not the usual uh, talking shop bullshit, essentially. So I think we can do that. So I'm excited about it.
Yeah, it's funny. One of the reasons that we've been thinking about it, and I actually didn't even tell you this. I was out for some. I was out for dinner with some friends a couple nights ago, and they were talking about a neighborhood association and about how it was a men's club in the neighborhoods association. There was some controversy about whether it should continue to be a men's club or not be a men's club. Is that really keeping with the 21st century? And I've sort of always found myself thinking that one thing that modern society has lost is just the idea of clubs and associations in general. Like my grandparents, especially on my mom's side, they were members of like several different clubs and organizations, and that was their social life. Like their social life was not at work. It was not with their college buddies. It wasn't anything like that. It was like, no, they joined these groups where they had similar interests or were in similar areas or kids of similar age. And that was the way that they actually um, made friends. And if you actually go back and read George Kennan's very famous Telegram X, where he talks about, everybody thinks George Kennan was all about containment, but he actually wasn't really about containment if you really read him right. But one of the things he talks about in Telegram X is about how the real strength of the United States is its bowling clubs and its affinity groups, and that the Soviet Union and all these communist powers, they didn't have anything like that because your neighbor could turn you into the party. Like it wasn't something that you actually wanted to do. That's a really highfalutin way of saying, we're not talking about just some sort of event or something where you're going to hang out with people and pay money to go to some fancy place. We want it to be comfortable, but it really is we're testing the waters on whether there's enough interest in these subjects where people would want to invest both time and money into building some kind of affinity group. Which is why we've had so much trouble. I think. What would we even call it if we launched it? Is it a club? Does that have bad connotations? Is it an association? I don't know. So, um, with that maybe out of the way, then let's move on to what people are actually here for, not to hear us pontificate about clubs and esoteric ways of hanging out with each other. As we promised last week, we are going to spend most of the time talking about an interesting study about about cash transfers and really about the meaning of work in general. And as Rob pointed out to me before we started recording, really all the things that are tying together what we're talking about today have to do with inflation. But before we get to that report, and we'll include a link to it in the show notes, it's kind of been a crazy week, Rob. We've got Venezuela elections, and if you missed the emergency podcast with Elo, it's a really excellent one. I would suggest you go back and listen to it. I don't think we will touch Venezuela that much on the podcast. But I mean, also some interesting things happening on the fringes of the world in general. Japan raised interest rates, which I thought was particularly interesting. Israel is assassinating everybody. It seems like Ismail Haniyeh from Hamas. They assassinated a Hezbollah commander. Seems like we're about to get some more Iran-Israel fireworks. Um, Ethiopia said that it's going to float its currency and for the first time concluded a major deal with the International Monetary Fund. So that feels like pretty significant news, pretty strange. There's an Angola potential ceasefire peace deal in the Democratic Republic of Congo. I mean, so you poke around, there's lots of things going on. But I think it's Ethiopia, and I should have mentioned. I always forget Nigeria for some reason. The massive anti-government protests that have broken out across Nigeria in response to some really, bone-chilling inflation. We're talking like 30 to 40% year on year, and 18 consecutive months of inflation. And I don't think they're record high level numbers of inflation for Nigeria, but anytime you're flirting with records in a country like Nigeria with an inflation history like them, pretty notable. So where do you want to start, Rob?
Why don't we start? I think it would be helpful in speaking of some of these individual circumstances to hear about Nigeria and Ethiopia, because these are nations that listeners might not be super up on what's going on, or what your thoughts are, and then we can sort of tie that into some of the broader frameworks that we think connect some of these around inflation and economic adjustments and things like that, because there are definitely common elements to all of these stories, but there are different situations kind of backing into those common elements as well. So maybe start with the differences.
Yeah, that's a good A/B test because everybody says they want information about what's going on in the world, but as soon as you start talking about what's happening in parts of the world where things are really happening, and you ignore the oh my god China stuff, like usually the listenership falls off a little bit. So we'll see if you're brave enough to stick around, y'all. Well, the two I think that we need to talk about are Ethiopia and Nigeria, and they're coming from very, very different places. So the background that you need on Nigeria is that Nigeria for years has just been a dumpster fire, but it's a real center of innovation within Africa itself. It's often described, or I've heard it described several times by folks who focus on emerging market economies as the poor man's India, which is really saying something because India is already really poor. But think of it that way: you have an incredibly diverse country, but it's also incredibly large, a lot of human capital within its own region. It's really where innovation and startups and tech is happening. Like if you're doing stuff, like you're going to um, Nigeria and you're starting there. So they have that sort of tradition with them. They also are rich in oil and other resources, but oil production has been falling off because of basic lack of repairs and infrastructure maintenance, because of Islamist insurgencies in the north and some of the areas where these pipelines run through, to the point where Angola has actually taken over as the largest producer of crude in Africa over Nigeria, which is embarrassing for the Nigerian government. Um, I forget exactly when it was. It was 12, 18 months ago, but they have a new president named Bola Tinubu. And he is trying to reverse all of this. And he's actually had some success with oil production. Oil production has gone up since he came into office. But he decided, or at least he ran on the idea that the government was corrupt, that it wasn't actually thinking about what was good for the economy in the long run, and that he was going to deliver the medicine. So he slashed electricity subsidies, he slashed energy subsidies. He's the Nigerian currency, the naira, has devalued twice since he became president, and you're getting the backlash. So you're getting labor unions who are saying this is bad. You're getting protesters out in the streets saying, well, this is causing inflation. We can't afford our food. We can't afford our power. You're getting all the usual militancy that you get around the fringes of Nigerian power. But it really is. Nigeria does seem to be a country of a well meaning president who was trying to execute policy change to get Nigeria out of a morass that it's been in because of 30 years plus of bad policy. So that's Nigeria. Um, Ethiopia is a little bit different in the sense that Abiy Ahmed, who is the prime minister of Ethiopia, is not as, I don't want to say virtuous, but he's a little bit more of a mysterious character. He was a darling of the West when he first came to power because he was talking about really establishing Ethiopia as a center for foreign investment, about stitching the country together. So it's also a very diverse country, as many of these African states are. There's not one Ethiopian nationality, there's all these different tribal elements and ethnic groups and things like that. He wanted to stitch together an Ethiopian federal national identity. And people loved that idea and thought he was this big reformer until the Tigrays challenged this notion and wanted autonomy or even independence within the Ethiopian federal state. And Abiy said, no, and I'm going to deploy the Ethiopian military to make sure that you cannot do that. And what ensues is a 2-year civil war in which hundreds of thousands have died and maybe a million plus were displaced. And all of that foreign investment and foreign capital went running for the hills. I myself, I was very optimistic on Ethiopia up until about 2019 when I was dealing with companies that were looking for off the beaten path places to locate manufacturing. Ethiopia was sort of my, hey, if you have some tolerance for risk, like labor is good here, human capital is good here, geographically we're pretty good. It's technically landlocked, but we can get around that with some of its relationships with countries on the border, and maybe they're trying to change that. I revised my view as a result of the Civil War, and I took a loss on that one, that it wasn't correct. Now, what you have is that the war has stabilized. They've managed to get violence down to a certain level, and now Abiy is trying to restore that shine for investors. So he's doing several different things, but the big one here is planning to float the currency, which caused a 30% devaluation almost overnight. And the second part of that is that now they're going to get a fairly large tranche of funding uh, from the IMF. They're going to save almost 4.9 billion from debt restructuring as a result of some of these deals and the things that they're doing. And I think the initial disbursement they're getting from a credit facility from the IMF is going to be 1 billion. God, I went on AP, and the listeners can't hear this. I just got assaulted with a bunch of ads as I'm trying to find this number for you. So if I look like I just had a seizure, that's why. Anyway, $1 billion disbursement and $3.4 billion credit facility overall. So those are some of the background details there, but they're very similar in the sense of the national structure and things like that. But I think they're very different in terms of both geography and also recent past and what these leaders are trying to push for in their respective countries.
The thing I find very interesting about both of them, and the way that I think that they connect to Egypt, which we spoke about last week, is just this notion of sort of orthodox restructuring of these economies and doing things that the IMF approves of in order to release funds for IMF rescue programs, or in part because they just believe it. They believe that by devaluing the currency, by reducing, kind of structural deficits, by reducing bread subsidies or fuel subsidies in many of these places, that they're going to attract private capital, that they're going to make the country more appealing to, mobile pools of capital that are looking around the world. And I think this is a really interesting conversation, and we spoke about this a little bit with Egypt, but given some of the developments this week in those two countries, it's worth thinking about this in a broader way, which is under what environment does that work and what environment does it not work? Because one of the things we've talked about so much here is, yeah, you want to be a global investor, you want to think globally in terms of allocating capital, and the US on a relative basis isn't as important, and it's going to be less important relative to everything else as the rest grows. But at the same time, there are huge landmines out there and countries that, in the environment that we're heading into or that we are in, are going to absolutely get creamed. And how do you identify what those countries are? And one of the things that I think is worth thinking about is, in an environment where you have increasing volatility, where you have increasing sort of risk premiums, is the trade off worth it to do what Egypt is doing or what Nigeria is doing? And what I mean by that is, you're taking money out of the pockets of your local consumers by essentially engineering inflation. That's what the devaluation does, because local consumers, are the ones who bear the brunt of that. Most of the elites in these countries have their money in other currencies already, so they're not
Hmm.
getting hit. Um, on the hope that by having a cheaper currency, you're going to be more competitive in your exports. I mean, that's essentially the trade-off you're looking to make. And I would suggest that in an environment where inflation is already high, and for all sorts of reasons, consumer sentiment is fragile, that that's not a good trade-off. And that historically, if you look, when countries try to do this against a background of global disarray and inflation, they don't usually emerge stronger, they emerge weaker. And on top of that, they run the risk of setting into motion sort of a self-reinforcing problem. Because if the inflation number accelerates, households pull in their horns and start to suffer, internal demand weakens, investment weakens, and then you're back where you started. So you have to devalue again, and then it's worse and worse and worse. That's the negative scenario that a lot of these countries face and prospect. And I think it's a realistic one for a lot of these places. Nigeria, Ethiopia. I mean, Ethiopia has sort of unique advantages, as you talked about, but even in that case, I think they're going to be hard pressed to bring them to bear relative to some of these issues that are emerging.
I think I also want to ask you then, I mean, does Japan fit into this narrative? Because, the Bank of Japan hiked its policy rate to around 0.25%, and it also halved its bond buying by about 3 trillion yen by the first quarter of 2026. And the reason I bring it up is because it's being described, at least, as the Bank of Japan embracing normalization. So after years of ultra easy policy, that the Bank of Japan is now more worried about inflation than it is necessarily with consumer demand as well. So, does the narrative here fit that even a country like Japan is pursuing normalization or orthodox measures? And is it different if you're a developed country versus a developing country there? How would you even work what the Bank of Japan is seeing into what we're talking about in some of these emerging markets?
No, it's completely different. So I would think of it in terms of almost black and white. I think one of the there's very few things you can talk about in finance or economics that are truly binary. Like, oh, there's this club and then there's this club. I think this is one of those things because the key question is, are you a country that can determine its own monetary policy? And there's a small handful of areas that can do this. The United States, most obviously, Japan, the European countries, and China. Those are pretty much the only ones. The rest of the world is going to be viewed on a relative basis to the big players, predominantly the dollar, predominantly the United States. And what I mean by that is, do you have autonomy in creating money, and you're going to be trusted to do so? So Japan is definitely in that club. Japan has the opposite problem for many of these countries. Japan's been printing money, you know, in massive amounts for decades, and no one because they're just printing it and they're not actually giving it to individuals to spend. Everyone kind of yawns and looks away. Oh, oh, another trillion yen, yada yada, right? Because it's just going into some bank's account and being exchanged for securities, and it doesn't matter because it's just stuff on paper, right? You can't do that if you're Ethiopia. Ethiopia can't engage in quantitative easing. And because these countries don't have truly independent monetary policies, that they need to retain um, sort of that discipline vis-a-vis the United States, vis-a-vis the developed nations, the currency becomes the outlet that they use to try to relieve the pressure, and that
Mhm.
creates all sorts of problems because they don't have the credibility to put a stop to it, a circuit breaker, if things do get out of hand.
Hmm. Well, that maybe is a good segue into what we wanted to talk about mostly, which is this paper from the National Bureau of Economic Research. Um, I'll let you sort of talk about it in broad strokes here, but it's basically a really, really large scale, well designed, randomized control trial about unconditional cash transfers in the United States. So a group was given $1,000 a month, I think, for roughly 3 years, as compared to a control group that received about $50 a month. Um, these people were the geography I think is important, or at least it was to me. So it's areas in and around Dallas, Texas, and in and around Chicago, Illinois. Um, and so they were trying to find out if cash transfers was something that was good, because there's a lot of uh, I guess there are a lot of policy implicate or not a lot of policy implications. There are a lot of policymakers who have been saying, and policy researchers that have been saying, that a good way to alleviate poverty is just to have direct cash transfers. Don't make it tied to other things. Just give people cash, and if they have the money in their pocket, they will be empowered to go get more education, or go find better jobs, or save, or invest, and that they'll do better in the long run. I think, Rob, you're going to underline the negative findings from the study. The study itself said that it found results that provide support for both sides of the debate. So it found that reductions in, for instance, reductions in labor supply were smaller than what had been documented in some settings. It saw that there was spillover to other household members who also sort of worked less as a result of the direct transfers. They found no evidence that job quality or human capital improvements helped at all. So just a big fat zero on human capital. They did find, on the other hand, that participants showed more interest in entrepreneurial activities and were willing to make more risks, or to take more risks, I should say. So they try to put that lipstick, or on the pig, or give a silver lining to what's going on into the study there. But I know that you're thinking that the study was hoping for one answer, or at least was maybe funded to give one answer, and it gave a very, very different answer.
Yeah, I think the best way to start with this is to begin really high level as to why we should care about this and put this into context relative to the conversation we just had about Ethiopia and Nigeria and, foreign places like that, and then speak to the study itself and what it means very specifically.
Hmm.
At the high level, why does this matter? It matters because the problems of the United States, and to a lesser extent or equal extent of Europe and developed countries, is not lack of capital. Ethiopia lacks capital. Nigeria lacks capital. They would invest in a lot more stuff if they could, if they can get the capital to do it. They have plenty of people. Nigeria has 180
Yeah.
million people, and half of them are under 25 years old. I mean, they have people, coming out of their ears. The issue in the United States is in many ways the opposite. And it's not just about demographics, it's about where is the scarcity? Because historically, we have more capital than we know what to do with. Um, and so, investment markets tend to be very efficient. Capital chases after, even fairly low return or or no return opportunities, depending on how animal spirits are doing.
Hmm.
That's been the experience of the last few decades. It's been one freaking bubble after another: housing, tech stocks, Bitcoin. Like, that's just how we do things. But the scarcity is not capital. The scarcity has been on the human side. And this is really important because if you look at the problems that have been emerging in recent years, it's not a lack of capital, it's a lack of people. And the inflation that we've experienced, and remember, this wasn't just in the post COVID period, it was more pronounced and more severe. But this was also the case in 2018, 2019, as the economy started to run hot.
Hmm.
Inflation started to go up. I mean, it's so hard to remember. It feels like a million years ago. But at that time, Jay Powell was, in a verbal battle royale with Trump about raising interest rates or not and inflation. That's symptomatic of the broader disease, which is that we have a scarcity of labor. And any business owner in the United States or anyone who knows a business owner can tell you it's really freaking hard to find people to work for you. That's the number one thing that people complain about and struggle with. So that has been the issue. And just to put some numbers around that very briefly, because it's helpful to think of this in concrete terms. If you were to look at unit labor costs, so this is per, person or per hour worked, what is the inflation to the employer? How much do you have to pay them, right?
Hmm.
And throughout the 90s, it was sort of low single digits, and then as the economy deflated and unemployment got higher in the 2000s to like the early 2010s, you were flirting with like 0%, 0.2%, 0.5%. And what does that mean? It means that's lower than productivity growth. So if productivity growth, the amount of output you're producing for every hour, is higher than your cost, then that's great. They love that because you're giving them more than they have to give you as a worker. And what you've seen in the last decade, heading into the latter part of the 2010s, is for the first time I'm looking at a chart that goes back to 1975. Since the first time since 1975, that downtrend in sort of the moving average is going up again. So it bottomed around 2010 at like zero.
Hmm.
And by 2018, 2019, you're talking about the high 2% range. And currently we're at 3.2% if you just take a smoothed average. So what does that mean? It means the cost of a business for every hour of work, like this is controlling for inflation, just the actual real cost is going up 3.2% year over year. That's significantly more than productivity. It means you're having to pay people more relative to what you're squeezing out of them. And this is the core underlying problem for US business and for economic growth, which is we have uh, a scarcity of humans, of people who want to work, and that's raising unit labor costs for the first time since our parents were our age or younger. I mean, two generations almost.
Yeah, it's funny. I was talking with an architect friend here in New Orleans just yesterday, and she was telling me that interest in projects, especially residential projects, had finally started to fall off a cliff. That for the first time, some of the contractors she knew were reaching out, asking if they knew of any jobs. And it wasn't because of materials, because lumber is back down to earth, and most of the materials are back down to earth, and it's no longer waiting 3 years for a freezer like I was when we were doing some renovation a couple of years ago now. But it was that they just can't find workers, and that the subcontractors are charging so much money that there's sticker shock from people in doing these projects because they can't do things in an economical way. So there's just an anecdotal example of what you're talking about. I'm also struck at how ironic this is because you've got record high numbers of migration, and like immigration is a problem in the election cycle and everything that's going on. So it's not like the US theoretically lacks for people if it wanted to figure out how to metabolize them in a way that was fair and equitable and legal and all these other sorts of things, but we can't seem to get there. But that might take us off course. So how does that lead in, do you think, to some of the things that you found in this study?
Yeah, and obviously immigration is a key element to come out of this, which we don't have to talk about today, but I think it's worth pointing out that that's a major issue. And just anecdotally, by the way, I don't think I told you this, but my wife's brothers, who are all engineers here in France, they're all have been training as electricians. because there's such an
Hmm.
opportunity to do just electrical work on the side. They all just last month took the exam, so now they're doing their day job as engineers, and then they're moonlighting as just electricians because there's so much money on the table because there's no electricians.
Well, it's funny you say that. So shout out to my good friend Mark, who's probably going to listen to this podcast, not immediately, but he usually listens sooner or later. And he and I have talked about this in general. We've talked about it from the point of view of college education, where, and you've probably seen this, Rob. You know, I don't have the exact statistics in front of me, but fewer and fewer men are going to college. It's the percentages are getting skewed so that more women are going to college and fewer men are going to college. And of course, the cost of college education is continuing to increase. I saw one estimate that by the time Annie is going to be a freshman in college, you might be paying 135 grand for a state school, not for some fancy hoity, or maybe it was for the fancy hoity-toity was 135 and the state school was 80. I forget, but it was a ridiculous amount of money, even if you were sending them to the state school. And my friend Mark has talked about how he knows some young people in his life who they don't want to go to college at all. They'd rather go be an electrician or a stonemason or some job where they can make 100K as soon as they have their job, and maybe there's a ceiling on what they make over time, but at least they're going to be making good money from the moment that they graduate, and it's something with their hands and it's something valuable and tangible, and they don't have to get involved with all of the politics that has happened in universities and things like that. So, I mean, we might actually get into that exactly, but I've heard that anecdote from other places too. So,
Well, just to follow up on that before we get into the actual study, the other data point I think it's worth noting in this context is if you look at the labor force participation rate for men in the United States, prime age men only. So this is leaving aside aging of the population, youth doing other stuff rather than getting jobs. These are men aged 25 to 54.
mm-hmm,
So the core part of the working age population. That participation rate peaked around 98% in the early 1950s, which is extraordinary. If you think
mm-hmm,
98% of men had jobs or were looking for jobs at that point, and it has declined in basically a straight line since then. So by the early 80s, it was at 94%. By 1999, it was 92. And then, very strikingly, after the year 2000, which was a recession and also the Chinese entry into the WTO, when you
mm-hmm,
saw a lot of manufacturing employment really decline quickly in the US because all of those industries that were hanging on basically got wiped out. The participation rate went from 92 to 90 within a decade. And then in the 2010s, it bottomed at 88.
mm-hmm,
Now here's the interesting thing. It bottomed at 88 in 2015, and it went up again for the first time in a very long time in the late 2010s, which is right when, as I said, the unit labor costs started accelerating again. So it went up again and then plummeted in COVID, and currently we're at 89.6, so 1.6% above the bottom in 2015. And that's really interesting because it shows you what sort of carrots do you need to hold out to people just to get a little bit of a improvement in that labor force participation ratio. So we're still, light years away from, the 1950s, 1960s, but we're, significantly below even the early 2000 number, but we're not going down anymore. And that's leads into this study that I think is so important.
Well, do you have the data for women too? Because I would assume that the percentage for women has skyrocketed since the 1950s.
It has. So I don't have the chart in front of me, but I memorize this sort of stuff. So the female participation rate, it did go up, like really started to go up big time in the 80s, and then it peaked out in the 90s, like the mid to late 90s, and then it sort of was like hovering around that level for a significant amount of time. It's below, or it was below, and now it's actually surpassed the male level, I believe. But all of those gains were made like 2.5 decades ago. And since then, female labor force participation has remained more durable than men, but it has come down from its peaks.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a big social kind of cultural element to that that's hard to pick out, which is why I think focusing on the men is a cleaner
Yeah.
comparison.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting to frame it that way. So, I mean, the paper, as you're talking about, if you have an excess of capital, which is how you're describing the United States, and a shortage of workers, or at least worker skills, I guess maybe it makes some sense to try and transfer the cash directly to people so that they can get the skills that they need. Or if they're not going to work, at least they can. I don't know. Like, how are you going to square that with what they found in the study?
Well, that's why I think this is the I made such a big deal about this study because I haven't seen anyone else talk about this. And this to me is a huge deal. And the reason is sort of what you say, because there's a very strong uh, you know, interest group or constituency in the US that has been calling for sort of universalized income. So pay people below a certain income threshold $1,000 a month, or there's different schemes and different ways to design these programs, but that I'm sure everyone who's listening to this has been familiar with some of this talk and has you know probably been following this at some distance. And this is really important because the philosophical argument behind this is twofold. The first is that this is a major way to share the benefits of the capital accumulation, the wealth growth that's been happening in the US, that's been driven more and more by a you know, smaller percentage of the workforce as people drop out. So you redistribute, give people an opportunity to sort of realize themselves, get a leg up. The positive vision of this was that people would use handouts, free money, to do good things, to get a better job that they would otherwise, because they don't have the wolf at the door quite as much as they did otherwise, to go back to school, whereas otherwise they might not have done that, to start a new business because they have a little extra money to fall back on, in getting it going. Like all of these sort of ideas, and they intuitively they make so much sense, right? It feels right. Like, yeah, provide this to people, and maybe you'll even solve some of these labor force participation issues, some of these other social issues that we're experiencing. And the reason why I bring this up is because the results of this, which is the first large scale, well designed, randomly controlled trial of this ever done in the US, were just so goddamn bad. And it and I know you said that the study authors tried to say, oh, it supported both sides. If you look at what's actually reported in the results, it's unequivocally bad. And that has huge implications for not only, specifically these universal basic income programs and the people proposing them, but also for this notion of like, what is the future for a capitalist economy? What is the future for the United States? And the reason why I say that is, and we can talk to the specific issues within the paper, but the general takeaway is that like leisure is good. People like leisure. And it makes sense when you think about it. Like all of the stuff that people like to do is like pretty cheap or next to free. The internet is free, social media is free, video games are cheap. Um, and people have talked about this, and I've heard people writing about this in sort of the cultural sphere, like, oh, why would people get a job when they can play, Fortnite all day? That sort of kind of old man shaking his fist sort of stuff. But the data really does put a feather in the cap of that argument, and it puts real numbers around it. And that's really, really noteworthy because what happened was in this study, basically the people who got handouts like meaningfully decreased their participation in the workforce. They did not go back to school. There was no evidence of any human capital formation. Like people didn't take this and read books and go start businesses and go back to college. There was none of that. They didn't even, if you look, I mean, it's really messed up. If you look at specific, because it was such a well designed study, they collected specific information on like, well, what did you do more of? Like very specifically, walk the dog, do the dishes, like that sort of thing. There was no increase in uh, exercise, in community involvement, in caring for older people, in caring for your own children. Even the
Yeah.
people who have kids did not care for their own children. They just were
But,
working less and they were spending it more on leisure for themselves.
well, and not only that, they cared for their own children less. Like, it wasn't just that it stayed stagnant. It was like less childcare, less sleep, less exercise was actually just about flat. But yeah, I noticed that.
So, you know, the quote that I think is the takeaway from this is the study authors at the end they say, you know, the real conclusion is we have a new appreciation for quote the high value that participants place on leisure at the margin. And I don't mean to paint this all in a negative sense because leisure like isn't leisure the point? Like
Well,
if
no,
you
it's
go,
fine. I want you to be the old man on the lawn because I had the same thought when I was reading all this because I think wasn't it Henry Ford who imagined a world in which the American worker wouldn't have to work anymore, where we would all be so fabulously wealthy that we would just like we would have robots and the whole economy would work and we
Henry
would all
Ford
be.
imagined a lot of crazy shit. I'm sure that was
Yeah, well, he also, some of it worked, and he made
yeah.
more money than we'll ever know.
No one has to work and there's no Jews.
Yeah, well, sorry
Sorry,
about the
sorry,
latter
Henry
half of that,
Ford.
Henry. I'm still kicking around here. Um, but yeah, I mean, just to say that, like, I do think there is, uh, it's almost like pathological the way that the United States valorizes work, that you need to be working all the time and that you should derive your life meaning from work and that where you live should be dependent entirely on your job opportunities. Like, there is something to the United States about that where if you have increasing productivity and you don't need as many workers to work as before, well, okay, like that's fine. It's okay that people want more leisure. And this was actually the second thing I thought was a little bit was maybe problematic about the study because you're right that it was designed extremely well, but the participants who got the transfers, they averaged a household income of about $29,900 in 2019 dollars. So the transfers themselves were a 40% increase in household income. But and even though I mean, that's a pitying amount of money, especially in cities like Chicago. Like, I have trouble imagining just what the quality of life looks like if your household income, let's say you have two, three kids and your household income is 30 grand. I mean, that's pretty grim. But these are people who are working. They are bringing in income. We're not talking about people who are on the street, who are homeless, who have no opportunities, who failed out of schools, things like that. And there was some part of me that was like, okay, if you gave the cash transfer to the homeless guy, would that change things a little bit more? Would that allow him to buy some clothes and get some rent and get sort of into the normal flow of things versus you've got a household that is probably absolutely exhausted and feeling constantly inferior based on what people are doing around them. So great, you increased my household income by 40%. I was already breaking my back just to get the 30,000. So I'm going to work a little bit less. And yeah, my total household income, excluding the transfers, is going to decrease. But as you say, like, I wasn't doing any of the things I wanted to be doing before. Like, if you looked at these time use outcomes and did it for somebody who was uber wealthy, like, I bet they're watching their kids even less than these people who just got the cash transfers. They're probably paying one of these people to watch their children. And I wonder if that can get in there too. So I don't know. I did have this reflexive reaction to it, which was there's no problem with leisure. Like, there is a virtue to hard work, but sometimes I think we lionize hard work a little bit too much.
Yeah, and I want to make that very clear because this is not an argument that, oh, this is so bad. Um, what I think needs to be acknowledged is that the theories about this are just the preconceptions were shown to be wrong, which doesn't mean that you shouldn't have the conversation about, well, what is a good society? Is it good to give, you know, greater transfers to households who are, you know, on the bottom third of the income spectrum to give them more leisure? Like, I don't know. That's a question that needs to be addressed. That's a philosophical question, and it's a question we're going to have more and more as the notion of, you know, labor replacing robots becomes a real thing. And I know that sounds like science fiction, and those things are not here. But if you look, labor replacing robots already, like, that was already an issue in manufacturing. Like, that's been around for 25 years. Like, the US manufacturing production has not gone down. It's just been robots doing the production and not people doing the production and the sort of
Hmm.
production that robots can do. And as you sort of, I mean, if you look at the labor figures, the people who are working over the last 25 years, there's been a huge shift away from sort of export competing sectors like manufacturing and into basically fast food and Chipotle and,
Yeah.
leisure services, things that are necessarily rooted in being in a specific place, in like shit jobs. These are bad jobs. Making burritos all day is not fun. It's not interesting. So now the robots are coming for that. It's very super nascent, but within the next 7 years, like, there's already pilot programs being run by places like Sweetgreen and Chipotle to try to, turn these lower level service jobs into jobs that robots can do. And what are robots? Robots are capital embodied. They're stuff with arms and legs and vision systems that allow them to manipulate things like a human would. And capital is stuff. So I'm sort of going on and off the deep end here, but my point is, like, leisure is not necessarily a bad thing, but we need to have a realistic discussion about what are we heading toward here? Because clearly the notion that, like, oh, you're going to do this and it's going to be this uplifting, thing, and like, that romantic vision is clearly not playing out, and is not going to result from these programs.
Yeah, I'm with you there. I got distracted actually because I was looking at some data because when you started talking about fast food, I wanted to put this at the beginning of the podcast, but if people have stuck around long enough, they get to have it here. Did you see, Rob, that Starbucks had terrible earnings, dropped about what 15% because people are consuming less Starbucks coffee, and I saw lots of interesting analysis about, well, why this was, and was it people spending less on fancy Starbucks drinks, and maybe inflation is really coming off the boil. And I wanted to put to you that I've been here consistently on this podcast telling you that Starbucks coffee is really shitty and that you should short it based on the quality of that coffee. I just made the clients who shorted it a lot of money on that 14, 15% drop. But to your point, they're also having trouble with labor. They're also having trouble keeping people. And Howard Schultz, who is no longer, I think he's no longer even associated with Starbucks anymore. Obviously, he was the founder and there for a long time, but he's no longer even on the board. And he put out this huge message, I think, on LinkedIn where he was like, look, the thing that made Starbucks really good was the service, to which I wanted to say exactly right, because people weren't there for the coffee. And he said, like, we really need to go store by store and figure out who are we hiring and are they treating people correctly? Because what I'm seeing in this data, it's less about people less willing to spend on Starbucks, but more about, hey, if I can go to the mom and pop coffee shop and get better service there, I'd rather get that. So maybe that ties in as well too. But I'm with you on the philosophical question. I think it also actually dovetails with what we talked about a couple of weeks ago after the Trump assassination, because I couldn't help when I was reading this study and went a little bit down the rabbit hole of cash transfers. It sort of felt early 1910s progressive-y, like policymakers trying to figure out what knobs to twist and which levers to pull to make things better for the common worker. And we were talking about McKinley and Roosevelt in the context of the assassination attempt against Trump, but a similar time where industrialization and electrification is changing the types of jobs that people have, and you're in this situation where you've got children in sweatshops, and you don't have the 8-hour workday. You're lionizing 12-hour workdays and all these other sorts of things, and so the progressive movement comes in and tries to put some guardrails around that. I don't think things are so dire today. Like the people who are working hard today, like, I mean, you're doing light years better than you were doing in the 1910s. But maybe there is some kind of nascent movement here for how to think about these things and what policy has to do to make things better for the American worker. Because, I mean, also to your point, you brought it up sort of on the side, but I think it's worth noting, like globalization is in this data too. Like all of these jobs, a lot of these manufacturing jobs, they went away because they could be done cheaper in China, and so they were. And I would say that the thing that a country like Ethiopia or Nigeria or Egypt is betting on is that yeah, things are expensive in China now, and the politics is not so good with China right now. So if we can attract some small percentage of the jobs that are leaving China to come to our country, maybe there's a role for us in this export-led world that we were muscled out of before because we couldn't compete with China. I think that's going to be a really difficult needle to thread, but I think if you're thinking optimistically in those countries from a policy perspective, maybe that's what you're thinking. So my turn to drone on there right now. But the takeaway is short Starbucks, obviously. This is not investment advice.
Well, you said last week that you didn't think you had a very big podcast, but clearly it was big enough to tank Starbucks consumption globally when people realized that the coffee sucks based on your
I am just a
disclosure.
small man sharing his ideas about, my wife for my birthday got me a gift. She got me like a vacuum sealed thing so that I could actually grind my own beans. So when I'm on the road, I no longer have to deal with the disgusting stuff that's on the road. Thanks. Thanks, honey. I appreciate it.
So do you bring your own grinder with you, or how do you work that out?
Well, no, so you can grind the beans and then you put them in the vacuum seal thing. I'm a pour over guy, so I'll bring my own pour over thing and I'll bring the Hario filters or whatever, and then I'll have my little vacuum sealed thing of coffee. It's great.
It's
Yeah,
unbelievable.
Rob is nodding in quiet judgment, as I'm sure all of you are. But hey, it's one of the rare pleasures of life right now. Well, anything else you want to hit in the study? Because I mean, we're not going to solve the issue here in general, Rob. But I think it's interesting. I think we've pointed out a lot of things. We've pointed out inflation. We've pointed out policymakers trying to attack a problem and realizing that maybe this is not the way to attack the problem. We've put it in context of everything's happening at the macro level. Was there anything else you wanted to hit on before we say bye to the listeners?
No, I guess the only brief thing to point out is it is very similar. You mentioned the progressive period in the early 1910s. Like it is shockingly, reminiscent of that in some ways, because if you go back to that time again, that was dominated by sort of progressive visions of and frankly socialist visions of, if you improve the well-being of ordinary working people, bring them off of farms, they're going to elevate themselves. And this notion, John Maynard Keynes, that's who you were trying to think
Mm-hmm.
of. I don't think it was Ford. I think it was John Maynard Keynes,
Yeah,
who
you're
was,
right. You're right.
the Bloomsbury group, embodying their whole view was like, okay, you give these people the leisure, they're going to be like me, John Maynard Keynes. They're going to read poetry and they're going to study, Greek, and of course none of that happened. And then in the end, like all these progressives lamented and just bashed the rise of kind of consumer culture and you know, mass mechanization culture and all, that was the modernist kind of nightmare. And
Mm,
Virginia Woolf actually wrote, I don't know if you've ever seen this, there's a great book called The Intellectuals and the Masses, and it's
mm,
all about all the terrible shit that Virginia Woolf and D.H. Lawrence and all like that whole set were writing
mm,
to each other about ordinary people at that time. And Virginia Woolf was
mm.
like, I think all of these like uncouth working men should be gassed and like, but it's
Yikes.
just thinking of this notion of fast forward to today and like, okay, we're gonna essentially engage in the definition of socialism, redistribution of assets, and people are basically not going to take care of their kids, they're not going to go to school, they're not going to get, they're going to work less, and they're going to basically engage in leisure, which the big gap in the study was they didn't ask people specifically other leisure activities. What the heck was that? Like it's just a catch-all category. It's not doing housework, it's not being with your kids, it's not this, it's not that. But they don't say like, were you playing, the Harry Potter PlayStation game? Were you, scrolling
Well,
on your phone? Like
does
I'm
it
sure
make a
it's a lot of
difference
that.
though? Because that actually goes to what I was trying to say. Because okay, like reading, like learning to read Greek and reading Keats and other romantic poets. I mean, that's leisure. It's not doing anything for the economy. So if they were hoping that they were going to turn all these people into perfect
No,
little gentlemen,
reading was a separate category. They were not reading. That's for sure.
okay.
But it is kind of funny because it's like, you know, you have these visions of people doing these highfalutin artsy things, and most people just kind of want to, dick around with their leisure, and that's okay. Maybe I think Virginia Woolf had it wrong, and it's okay to have more leisure, even if it's not doing elevated things.
Yeah, I mean I mean that's a whole other interesting thing, which actually gets into the university conversation around that we were having, or that we talked about a little bit, versus the electricians, and it reminds me of uh, Alan Bloom's Closing of the American Mind. I don't know if you've ever read that book, but I think he published it towards the end of the '80s, and it made Bloom pretty famous. I mean, he was absolutely brilliant, but pretentious intellectual. And I remember, I mean, it's a really compelling book, and it talks about literally how, the American university student has declined, and the horizons of the normal American student are no longer what they once were. Um, but if you go and read it, there's a whole chapter in there where he uses the embrace of rock and roll music as evidence of the decline of American youth. And it's like they're gyrating their hips to the rhythmic blah, 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 where it's like, now compared to what we've got with T Swift, like you're enlightened if you're going back and listening to Led Zeppelin and Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young and all these others. So there's something weird happening there where an intellectual class, which doesn't have to do a lot of work, lionizes a particular kind of leisure, but says, well, oh, but this other leisure that you prefer, like that's not good. So I'd rather you get off your ass and go get another degree than just stream things on TikTok. Like, okay, like that's not really, like, leisure is leisure. You get to do whatever you want. And arguably it would be better to live in a world where we all had more leisure. Or maybe not. Maybe if we all have more leisure, things are going to get worse and it's all just going to turn into Wally. I don't know, but it's a difficult thing to wrestle with.
Well, I think the only thing you can be certain of is you can't tell people what to do, and you have to give them the freedom to make their own decisions. And uh, you know, that's that we're sort of reliving some of this, just like we did 100 years ago, where everyone's going to clutch their pearls about video games, that sort of thing. But in the
Well,
end, maybe it's
and not
good.
just and not just video games. I mean, we're not going to start the immigration conversation here, but we can leave it sort of. There's an easy. I won't say easy. There is a fix to this problem. This problem is not insurmountable, but you've also got clutching pearls about the ethnic identity of the United States and white people versus non-white people and what that looks like and what benefits non-white people get, that they should work for really low money, but they shouldn't have a legal like, it gets into all those things too. So there's a lot of pearl clutching happening all over the place, I think.
I think that's a real dilemma to be presented with for some of these people. Do you want to have your next door neighbor playing Fortnite on the dole, or do you want to live next to a hardworking Mexican? That's
Well, I don't want to live next to anyone. I want to live in the middle of nowhere where no one can bother me. So that's the answer to that question. But I think we'll leave it there for now, Rob. Anything else you want to say to the listeners before we say goodbye?
no, I think I've said enough for 1 week.
All right. Well, I think I did pretty well with no coffee. I don't think I completely embarrassed myself. So we'll see you guys next week. The views expressed in this commentary are subject to change based on market and other conditions. This podcast may contain certain statements that may be deemed forward-looking statements. Please note that any such statements are not guarantees of any future performance, and actual results or developments may differ materially from those projected. Any projections, market outlooks, or estimates are based upon certain assumptions and should not be construed as indicative of actual events that will occur. Cognitive Investments LLC is a registered investment advisor. Advisory services are only offered to clients or prospective clients where Cognitive and its representatives are properly licensed or exempt from licensure. For additional information, please visit our website at www.cognitive.investments. The information provided is for educational and informational purposes only and does not constitute investment advice, and it should not be relied on as such. It should not be considered a solicitation to buy or an offer to sell a security. It does not take into account any investor's particular investment objectives, strategies, tax status, or investment horizon. You should consult your attorney or tax advisor.